An isolated hunting lodge, a gunshot, and a dead body. Can you guess the killer's name? The dull ticking of a grandfather clock echoed through the sparse office. Hercule Poirot sat at his desk, his ever-watchful eyes scanning case files with meticulous precision. His mind, though worn by illness, was still sharp as a razor. His fingers, though weak, flipped through papers with the same grace they always had. Captain Hastings, standing nearby, was looking out of the window, his thoughts seemingly adrift. Poirot, without looking up from his paperwork, said in a soft, measured voice, "Monday, Ami, you seem restless today." Hastings sighed, his voice laced with anticipation. "Poirot, there's a certain unease in the air today. I can feel it. A new case, I'm certain of it." Poirot's lips curled into a faint smile, but it was one of those smiles that hid more than it revealed. He didn't respond, not immediately. His mind was already at work, his thoughts darting like birds in the wind, and then there came the knock. The sound was sharp, sudden, breaking the rhythm of the room, like a pebble breaking the stillness of a pond. Poirot's eyes flicked up, his gaze piercing through the fog of his own thoughts. He raised a hand, his index finger tapping the desk once his only gesture of acknowledgement. The door creaked open, and in stepped a man, disheveled and pale. His coat hung loosely around his shoulders, and his hand shook, a nervous twitch in his every movement. He had the air of someone who had been to the very edge and back, a man touched by something dark, something unspeakable. "Monday due," the man muttered, his voice thick with disbelief. "What is this madness?" Poirot's sharp eyes narrowed. "Mr. Havering, I presume?" he asked, his voice smooth but edged with curiosity. "What brings you to my humble abode?" The visitor, Roger Havering, took a hesitant step forward, his eyes darting around the room as if the very walls might whisper their secrets. He took a deep breath, and with it the scent of fear seemed to linger in the air. "My uncle, he has been murdered," Havering choked out, his voice barely a whisper. "And I—" Poirot's eyebrows arched slightly, and for a moment the world seemed to hold its breath. Hastings, who had been silent until now, stepped forward, sensing the shift in the atmosphere. "Poirot," Hastings muttered under his breath, "I have a feeling that another complex case is about to unfold." Poirot's eyes never left Havering's face. "You say your uncle was murdered?" Poirot asked, his tone cool but tinged with intrigue. "And yet you are not grieving as one would expect none." Havering flinched, then quickly adjusted his posture, trying to regain control. "It's not what you think," he stammered, his voice betraying him. "It's a nightmare. The police are overwhelmed. I don't know who to trust, but I need your help, please." Poirot sat back in his chair, fingers steepled beneath his chin, his mind already swirling with possibilities. He could feel the tension rising in the room, the strange unease that hung in the air like a storm about to break. His thoughts began to form a theory, a faint, fragile thread in the complex tapestry of this case, but he held it close to his chest, as was his way. He turned to Hastings, his gaze sharp and piercing. "Hastings, I am unwell, but you are not. You shall accompany Mr. Havering to the scene." Hastings, though intrigued, was taken aback by the sudden shift. "Poirot, are you sure? The case, it could be dangerous." Poirot gave a small, knowing smile. "I have no doubt, mon ami, that you will find danger where there is none. But there is something about this case, something that calls to me. Go with Mr. Havering, Hastings. Go, and let the truth unravel itself." Hastings hesitated, then nodded. There was a glimmer of something dark in the air, something that both pulled and repelled him. "I'll leave at once, Poirot." As they made their way to the door, Havering's eyes flickered with something fear. Guilt? Poirot didn't miss the shift. "Monday due," Poirot muttered under his breath as he watched them go. "There is more to this than meets the eye." Cliffhanger ending. The door closed behind them, and Poirot was left alone, the office heavy with the scent of impending doom. His eyes lingered on the files in front of him, but his mind was already on the case. "What has truly happened to Mr. Havering's uncle?" he whispered to himself. And what does the man himself hide? A sudden thought struck Poirot like lightning. Monday due, he muttered again. This case, it will change everything. The interview with Mrs. Middleton, the housekeeper. The tension in the lodge's dimly lit hallway was suffocating, as if the very walls held their breath. The air was thick with the scent of old wood and dust, and every creak of the floorboards seemed louder than before. Hastings' mind raced. He could feel it in his gut. There was something about this house, something lurking just out of reach, teasing him with the promise of secrets he wasn't yet ready to uncover. Japp's voice, low and measured, broke the silence. Ah, Hastings, your arrival only adds to the mystery. This case is quite complicated. Hastings gave him a sharp nod, his eyes still scanning the darkened corners of the hallway. Indeed, Japp, and I have a feeling there are some important clues hidden here. This place, it doesn't sit right. Japp raised an eyebrow, his face hardening. You're not the only one who feels that. Mrs. Middleton, the housekeeper, should know something. I've already spoken to her briefly, but her story, well, it's as strange as the rest of this damned place. The heavy footsteps of Mrs. Middleton echoed down the hallway, growing louder with each passing second. She rounded the corner with deliberate slowness, her face a picture of frailty, her eyes darting around nervously as if searching for something or someone wasn't there. Her once pristine uniform was now slightly disheveled, and her hands, clasped tightly in front of her, trembled ever so slightly. Ah, Mrs. Middleton, Japp began, his tone carefully neutral, yet laced with the unspoken question. I hope you're feeling well today. I trust you're still able to help us with the investigation. She nodded, but her eyes never quite met his. There was an unease about her, something almost evasive. Of course, Inspector. I'll answer whatever I can. Hastings watched her closely. Her gaze kept shifting to the corners of the room, as though she feared someone might be listening. His instincts, honed by years of experience, told him that something was amiss. Mrs. Middleton knew more than she was letting on. Hastings leaned in slightly, his voice warm but probing. You mentioned that you found Mr. Pace. Was there anything unusual about that night? Any strange sounds, or anything out of place? Mrs. Middleton stiffened at the question, her lips parting slightly as if to speak, but no words came out. For a brief moment, she seemed to freeze, her thoughts somewhere far away. The silence stretched, unbearable, before she finally whispered, I heard something. Hastings leaned forward, his eyes narrowing. What did you hear, Mrs. Middleton? Her breath quickened, and she glanced around the hallway as though she were afraid of being overheard. It wasn't human. She muttered, almost to herself, her voice trembling. It came from the study. A strange scraping sound, and then a whisper. Hastings exchanged a look with Japp, his suspicion growing. A whisper? What kind of whisper? Mrs. Middleton looked at them, her face pale as the fog that clung to the windows outside. I couldn't make it out. It wasn't clear, like someone was trying to stay hidden. But I swear I heard the words, don't look. The air around them seemed to grow even heavier, the shadows stretching longer, as the words echoed in Hastings' mind. Don't look. What was that supposed to mean? Was someone trying to keep her, or perhaps them, from seeing something they weren't meant to? Hastings pressed on, his voice low but insistent. And what happened after you heard this whisper? Did you go into the study? Mrs. Middleton's face contorted with a mixture of fear and regret. Number I didn't. 2 was too scared. I stayed away. I thought maybe I was imagining it. I don't know what to think anymore. The house. It's been strange for years. But since Mr. Pace died, things have only gotten worse. Japp stepped closer, his eyes narrowed, now more focused than ever. Strange. How so? Mrs. Middleton swallowed, her throat dry. She glanced at the door behind her, as though she expected someone or something the other side. There are noises. In the walls. Sometimes I hear scratching. And the mirrors, they've been changing. I don't know how to explain it, but there's something in this house. Something that's not right. Hastings couldn't help but feel a chill creep up his spine. Mirrors? What do you mean by changing? Her voice dropped to a whisper, as though speaking aloud the very words might make them real. They show things that aren't there, faces that aren't mine. I've tried to ignore it, but every time I look into one, I feel like I'm being watched. Japp exchanged another look with Hastings, his brow furrowing. Is it happening now? Mrs. Middleton shook her head quickly, her hands wringing in front of her. Not now. But the last time I saw it just a few hours ago, looked into one of the mirrors and saw a man. His face was twisted, and then he smiled at me. But when I turned around, there was no one there. Hastings and Japp both stood frozen for a moment, absorbing the weight of her words, a house that whispered secrets, mirrors that shifted with shadows, and a man who smiled at her. The mystery deepened with every second, each word more puzzling than the last. What was going on in this house, and why was Mrs. Middleton so clearly terrified? As the three of them stood there in the tense silence, there was a sudden noise, loud and unmistakable. The unmistakable sound of something heavy falling to the floor, followed by a muffled cry. All three turned in unison toward the staircase, hearts racing. Hastings' voice was barely above a whisper. What was that? Before anyone could answer, there was the unmistakable sound of footsteps, fast and heavy, rushing toward them. Mrs. Middleton gasped, her face pale with fear. It's him. Without another word, she bolted toward the back door, her figure vanishing into the shadows of the hallway. Japp swore under his breath. No, wait, he shouted, but it was too late. The mystery had thickened, and Hastings knew that no matter where they turned, the answers would be just out of reach, until it was too late to stop the truth from unraveling. Cliffhanger ending. As they stood frozen, the last thing they heard before the door slammed shut was the faint sound of a voice, a whispering, almost mocking laugh. The investigation had taken a dark turn, and whatever was waiting for them in that lodge was no longer a puzzle. It was a threat. Mrs. Middleton's revelation. The house felt colder, almost suffocating, as Mrs. Middleton's words hung in the air. Every second seemed to stretch into eternity. The air in the hallway grew dense with an ominous weight, and even Japp's usual stern demeanor couldn't hide the subtle shift in his posture. He knew they were teetering on the edge of something far more sinister than a simple murder. Mrs. Middleton, her frail hands still gripping her apron, shifted uncomfortably on her feet. Her face was drained of color, and her eyes flickered around as if the very walls of the house were closing in on her. I saw him, she murmured, her voice barely audible, her words carrying a heaviness that seemed almost too reluctant to share. Her eyes met Hastings briefly, but quickly dropped to the floor as though she were afraid of revealing something too dreadful. A black-bearded man, she continued, swallowing hard. A strange man, not from around here. His eyes, they were wild, as if he'd been searching for something or someone. Hastings' instincts flared to life, his mind already weaving together the fragments of her words with the other clues they had uncovered. There was something off about this, something that felt more than just a chance encounter. Mrs. Middleton's voice trembled as she continued, but the fear in her eyes seemed to reach deeper than the mere recounting of a fleeting figure. He seemed agitated, like he was waiting for someone. But I thought nothing of it at the time. Mrs. Middleton's words trailed off, as if she was caught in the whirlpool of her own recollection, her hands shaking visibly. Hastings stepped closer, his voice soft, yet probing. When did you see this man, Mrs. Middleton? Was it on the night Mr. Pace died? She nodded faintly, the corner of her mouth twitching. Yes, just before it happened. I was in the kitchen. And then he appeared, standing by the garden gate, watching the house. I thought I was imagining it. He looked out of place, but I never saw him go inside. A chill crept through Hastings' veins. A stranger, a man with no clear connection to the family, had been lurking on the property the very night Mr. Pace was killed. Could he have been involved? And why had Mrs. Middleton dismissed him so easily at the time? Hastings didn't let his thoughts show. He knew better than to let emotions cloud his judgment. But the puzzle was beginning to take a more dangerous turn. There was something about Mrs. Middleton's manner that felt increasingly disconnected from the gravity of her revelation. Mrs. Middleton, Hastings said slowly, trying to peel back the layers of her unease. You're certain of this man's appearance? Could you describe him more clearly? Anything unusual about his behavior? She hesitated, her eyes darting to the door again, as if expecting something or someone to appear. Her voice dropped to a whisper, barely above the sound of the wind creeping through the cracks of the old house. There was something strange about him, she confessed, her words trembling with suppressed fear. He had this mark on his left hand, a symbol like a circle, with lines radiating out from the center. It wasn't like anything I've ever seen before. Hastings' mind raced, the symbol echoing in his thoughts. A mark? A sign of something more? Could it have been part of something larger, an organization, or a message meant only for certain eyes? Jap, having been unusually quiet up until this point, leaned in closer, his gaze sharp. A mark, you say? Did you get a good look at it? Mrs. Middleton nodded but seemed distant now, as though she were staring into something only she could see. Yes, it burned into my mind. It was red, not like ink, more like blood. The silence that followed was thick with meaning. A man with a strange mark, standing by the garden gate, watching the house, and the blood-red symbol an unmistakable sign of something sinister. Could this mark be connected to the murder? To Mr. Pace's death? Hastings' suspicion was mounting, but there was something nagging at him, a deeper layer that had yet to be uncovered. Mrs. Middleton wasn't just telling them what she knew. There was something she wasn't saying, something she was holding back. He leaned forward, his tone firm but gentle. Mrs. Middleton, you must tell us everything you know. This man, his mark, anything else unusual you noticed about him, anything at all. For a long moment, Mrs. Middleton remained silent. Then, in a voice barely above a whisper, she spoke again, her eyes wide with fear, as though she had just made a terrible realization. There's something I didn't tell you, something I didn't want to believe, but now I'm sure. She paused, her breath shallow, as if the very act of speaking the words was too much to bear. After he left the garden gate, it was locked, but the key, it was gone. The room seemed to close in around them, the walls pressing tighter with the weight of her words. The key, gone. Had the stranger taken it? Had he locked something away, something that was meant to stay hidden? Before Hastings could respond, a loud crash echoed through the house, followed by a scream sharp, desperate, and full of terror. Without a moment's hesitation, Hastings turned to Jap. That scream, it came from the upstairs. Jap didn't waste a second. Stay close. We'll deal with Mrs. Middleton later. As they rushed toward the staircase, Hastings' mind raced. The pieces were falling into place, strange symbols, a mysterious man, a missing key, and now a scream that could mean the discovery of something dark and dangerous. But the question remained, what was really happening in this house, and who was behind it all? Cliffhanger ending. As they reached the top of the staircase, the last thing they heard before the door slammed shut was the unmistakable sound of a key turning in the lock from the inside. The discovery of the body. The hallway was eerily silent, save for the creaking floorboards beneath their hurried steps. A heavy unease hung in the air, thick as fog, as Hastings and Mrs. Middleton approached the closed door at the end of the corridor. The scent of aged wood and cold stone filled the space, but beneath it, something more sinister lurked, a faint, acrid tang in the air that sent a shiver down Hastings' spine. Mrs. Middleton clutched the edges of her apron, her hands trembling. Her breath came in uneven gasps, as though the mere act of revisiting the memory was suffocating. I was downstairs, she whispered, her voice barely carrying over the stillness, tending to the fire when I heard it. Hastings turned to her sharply. The gunshot. She nodded, eyes darting toward the closed door, as if afraid something might burst forth at any moment. Loud, sudden. It had shattered the silence, like thunder on a clear night. She swallowed hard. At first, I thought I had imagined it, but then, the house fell too quiet. Hastings felt a deepening sense of foreboding. It was the kind of silence that didn't belong in a house where life had once thrived, the kind that carried the weight of something final. Jap, standing beside them with his usual no-nonsense demeanor, exhaled sharply. Right, No more standing about. Let's see what we're dealing with. With a firm push, Jap swung the door open. What lay beyond sent a chill racing through Hastings' veins. The room, dimly lit by the dying embers of a fireplace, was in a state of unnatural stillness. Heavy velvet curtains were drawn, blocking out the moonlight. But the real horror lay at the center of the room. Mr. Pace was seated in a high-backed chair, his head tilted unnaturally to one side. His lifeless eyes stared blankly into the void, his face frozen in an expression of shock. A single bullet hole marred his temple, a thin trickle of dried blood streaking down his cheek. But it wasn't just the gruesome sight that made Hastings' stomach twist. It was something else. Something wrong. There was no weapon in sight. Jap muttered a curse under his breath. Damn it, no gun. Hastings took a cautious step closer, scanning the room, his mind racing. How is that possible? His voice was hushed, as though speaking too loudly might disturb the oppressive weight of death in the air. If it was suicide, the gun should be here. Mrs. Middleton whimpered behind him, her hands clasped tightly together as she peered into the room, eyes wide with terror. But it was locked, she choked out. The door was locked from the inside. No one went in, no one came out. Hastings turned sharply. Are you certain? She nodded furiously, her pale face reflecting nothing but fear. Jap stepped forward, running a hand through his hair, his expression darkening. That means one thing. Hastings met his gaze. Murder. A tense silence followed, the weight of that single word sinking into the room like a lead weight. But before anyone could speak again, tap, tap, tap. A soft sound echoed through the room. Hastings spun toward the source of the noise. His breath hitched. The window. Beyond the thick curtains, something, or someone, was there. Jap reacted first, lunging toward the heavy drapes and yanking them open. But the moment he did, nothing. Only the cold, endless darkness of the night stared back at them. The garden below lay untouched, not a single footprint in the damp earth beneath the window. Yet Hastings could have sworn, for just a fraction of a second, he had seen movement, a shadow slipping away into the night. Jap turned back to them, his jaw tightening. Someone was watching us. A chilling realization slithered through Hastings' mind. Whoever had killed Mr. Pace was still close, perhaps too close. Then, from somewhere deep within the house, another gunshot rang out, and the lights flickered, plunging the house into darkness. Cliffhanger ending. The house is now engulfed in darkness, a second gunshot shattering the silence. Who fired the shot? Is the killer still inside? And what are wows at the window? The mystery deepens. The vanishing pistol. A shudder ran through Mrs. Middleton's frail frame as she clutched her apron, her breath uneven. The dim glow of the hallway lamps cast long, flickering shadows on the walls, distorting reality as if the house itself were breathing. We heard the shot, she whispered, her voice laced with fear. A loud, sharp noise, and then silence. Hastings and Jap exchanged glances. Silence. That word always carried weight in a crime scene. A natural silence was one thing, but the unnatural stillness that followed a gunshot, that was something else. Something final. Jap pushed open the heavy wooden door. It creaked ominously, the sound cutting through the tense air. The room was dimly lit by the fireplace, its embers barely glowing. Shadows stretched across the floor, and the scent of gunpowder still lingered, faint but unmistakable. The air was heavy, charged with something Hastings couldn't quite name, a lingering presence of death itself. And there, in the grand chair by the fireplace, slumped unnaturally, was Mr. Pace. Hastings' stomach twisted at the sight. The man's lifeless eyes stared blankly ahead, his body rigid, frozen in the moment death had claimed him. A single bullet wound marred his temple, a thin rivulet of dried blood running down his pale cheek. His hands rested on the armrests, as if he had been in the middle of contemplation when fate intervened. Jap inhaled sharply. Shot clean through the temple. Professional job. But Hastings wasn't listening. His gaze had been drawn to the wall. Mounted above the fireplace were two pistols at least. There should have been two. One was missing. Hastings stepped closer, narrowing his eyes at the empty space where the second pistol should have been. There were two here. His voice was quiet, but edged with suspicion. One's gone. Japp frowned, following Hastings' line of sight. Odd. If this were suicide, wouldn't the gun be here? Exactly. Hastings turned to Mrs. Middleton. Were both pistols there earlier? She hesitated. Yes, sir, Mr. Pace. He was particular about them. Said they were a pair, valuable. He never let them out of his sight. Hastings glanced back at the lifeless man in the chair. A single bullet wound, a missing gun, a locked room. None of it made sense. Then, Japp's voice cut through the quiet. Someone took it. The words sent a chill down Hastings' spine. A gun, missing from a room that was supposedly locked. If no one had entered, where had it gone? And more importantly, who had taken it? Before anyone could speak again, a sudden gust of wind rattled the window. The glass panes shivered, and for a brief second, Hastings thought he saw a momentous shadow slipping away into the darkness beyond. He strode to the window and flung it open. Cold air rushed in, biting against his skin. He scanned the garden below. No footprints in the damp earth, no sign of an intruder. But the feeling remained someone had been watching them. Japp stepped up beside him, his voice low. Whoever it was, they're gone now. Hastings clenched his jaw. Or worse, he turned back to look at the darkened hallway stretching beyond the room. They're still inside. Cliffhanger ending. The missing pistol raises disturbing questions. If Mr. Pace was murdered, why was one gun taken? And if no one entered or left the room, how did the killer escape? Just as Hastings and Japp turn back toward the hallway, the distant echo of footsteps reaches their ears. Someone is moving inside the house. The mystery deepens. A crime too perfect. Hastings stood by the fireplace, his eyes fixed on the unsettling scene before him. The flickering embers cast eerie shadows across the room, playing tricks on the walls, stretching, twisting like silent specters bearing witness to the murder. His fingers tapped lightly against the polished wood of the mantel as his thoughts churned. Something about this crime. It felt too neat, too well executed, too planned. Hastings thinking. A man shot cleanly through the temple. A missing gun. A locked room with no sign of forced entry. And yet, there is no sense of panic. No struggle. No last-minute resistance. It's as if the murderer knew exactly what they were doing. As if they rehearsed it. His gaze drifted to the victim's rigid hands. They rested unnaturally still on the armrests, fingers slightly curled but not clenched, not the hands of a man who had fought back. Japp knelt beside the body, his sharp eyes scanning every detail. No sign of a struggle, he muttered, confirming Hastings' suspicions. Whoever did this must have been standing real close. He glanced toward the pistols on the wall. One's missing. Why take it? Why leave one behind? Hastings nodded, his unease growing. The crime had an uncanny precision to it. Every element controlled, as if pieces of a puzzle had been carefully placed. Mrs. Middleton, still pale and trembling, wrung her hands nervously. It was that man, I tell you, she whispered. The one with the black beard. I saw him. Japp shot her a sharp glance. You're sure about that? She hesitated, her brow furrowing. I think so, yes. He was here earlier, looked anxious, kept pacing outside the lodge, glancing at the windows, and then the gunshot. She swallowed hard, her voice barely above a whisper, and then silence. Hastings thinking. She's afraid, but is she afraid because she saw something, or because she knows something? Japp stood, dusting off his hands. Well, we need to find this man, and fast. Hastings turned his gaze toward the door. The hallway stretched into darkness beyond, the dim light from the room failing to reach the distant corners. A strange sensation crept over him, like the air itself held a secret, waiting to be discovered. Then, just as the silence began to settle once more, a sound shattered it. Tap, tap, tap. Faint, deliberate footsteps echoed from the corridor. Slow, measured, as if someone was watching, waiting. Hastings' breath caught. He turned sharply, his eyes narrowing into the shadows. "Jap," he said quietly, his voice tense. "We're not alone." The inspector's hand moved instinctively to his pocket, where his revolver rested. Mrs. Middleton let out a soft gasp. The footsteps stopped. A pause. And then, a door creaked open somewhere in the house. The three of them froze. A chill settled over the room. The air felt heavier, charged with something unseen. Someone was still here, and they were moving in the darkness. Cliffhanger ending. Hastings realizes the crime is too precise, too methodical, suggesting a calculated mind at work. Just as he begins to suspect that something far more sinister is unfolding, an unseen presence makes itself known. The house is no longer just a crime scene. It is a trap. Who is lurking in the shadows? And what will they do next? The first twist, a performance too perfect. Hastings adjusted his coat as he stepped into the dimly lit sitting room of the lodge. A single lamp flickered, casting trembling shadows across the walls. The room smelled faintly of burnt wood, and something floral lavender, perhaps, but overbearing, as if someone had doused themselves in it to mask another scent. At the far end of the room, Mrs. Zoe Havering sat on a velvet armchair, her body slumped forward, hands clutching a delicate lace handkerchief. Her auburn hair framed her face in soft waves, her lips trembling as she pressed the fabric to them. She was the picture of grief, perhaps too much so. Her eyes brimming with unshed tears lifted to meet Hastings. This is unbearable," she whispered, voice quivering. Uncle Pace, gone, just like that." She let out a choked sob, her shoulders shaking violently. A performance, a flawless one. But Hastings had seen genuine grief before. It was never this, measured. Hastings, thinking. A woman in mourning either collapses under sorrow or fights to maintain composure. But this is something else. Still, he played his part. "Mrs. Havering, I understand this must be a terrible shock. If you don't mind, can you tell me about the last time you saw your uncle?" She gasped, clutching at her heart, as though the mere suggestion of recalling such a memory would shatter her. "Last night," she murmured, "we dined together. He was in good spirits." And then, she let out another dramatic breath. And then, the gunshot. I thought my heart had stopped. Hastings watched her carefully. "And your husband, was he home at the time?" Her lashes fluttered too, calculated. "Number Roger was away on business. He left that afternoon." "He couldn't have." Her voice broke, but Hastings noted that her hands, hidden beneath the folds of her silk dress, were as still as a pond at dawn. Jap, standing near the fireplace, cleared his throat. "Mrs. Havering, forgive me, but do you recall seeing any strangers around the house last night?" Her head snapped up, the sudden motion betraying her. "Strangers," she repeated. No one at all." A pause. Too long. Hastings exchanged a glance with Jap. Something was off. Why hesitate on such a simple question? Then, Mrs. Havering lowered her head again, dabbing at her dry eyes. "I'm sorry. It's all too much." Hastings, thinking. Too much, or too rehearsed. Suddenly, a sharp sound. Thud. All three turned. Somewhere in the house, a door had closed, but they were the only ones in the room. Mrs. Havering gasped. "What was that?" Jap muttered under his breath and moved toward the hallway. Hastings followed, his pulse quickening. The air felt thick, charged with something unseen. They stepped out into the corridor. Silence, but someone had been there. Jap's fingers hovered over his revolver. And then, a faint shuffle, a presence. Hastings felt it before he saw it. The dark outline of a man's figure at the end of the hallway, watching, waiting. The moment their eyes met, the figure turned and bolted into the shadows. Cliffhanger ending. Mrs. Havering's grief seemed staged, raising questions about her sincerity. As Hastings and Jap begin to suspect something is amiss, a mysterious intruder is discovered lurking inside the house. Who is he? And what secret is he hiding? Suspicions and secrets. The air inside the hunting lodge felt heavier than before. The dim glow of the fireplace flickered against the walls, casting long, wavering shadows as Zoe Havering pressed a trembling hand to her forehead. Her silk dress rustled with every movement, the lace of her handkerchief barely damp despite her constant dabbing at non-existent tears. "Zoe, it's terrible, just terrible. I can't believe Uncle Harrington is gone." She let out a deep, shuddering breath, her eyes darting between Hastings and Inspector Japp, as if searching for sympathy in their expressions. But Hastings wasn't convinced. Something about her performance seat was too perfect. Her grief seemed calculated, her sorrow well-timed. He had seen people in shock before, and they were either numb with disbelief or overcome with genuine emotion. This, however, felt staged. Hastings. Every sob, every gasp, every trembling sigh, it's all precise, controlled. Is she truly mourning, or just putting on a show? Japp, ever the professional, remained unmoved by the theatrics. He pulled out his notepad and cleared his throat. "Japp. Mrs. Havering, let's get the facts straight. Where exactly were you when the gunshot rang out?" Zoe hesitated. Just for a second. Too long. "Zoe. 2 was in my room. I had just finished my evening tea. I heard the gunshot and ran out, but by then it was too late." Japp scribbled something down, his expression unreadable. He turned to Hastings. "We've checked Mr. Havering's alibi. He was in London at the time, seen by multiple witnesses. He couldn't have done it." Hastings didn't miss the way Zoe's fingers tensed at the mention of her husband's alibi. Hastings. Strange. A wife should be relieved that her husband is cleared, but she looks uneasy. Japp continued, flipping through his notes. He had dinner at his club, played a round of cards, and even checked into his hotel. A rock-solid alibi. Zoe. Yes, Roger couldn't have been involved in this. Loved Uncle Harrington. Again, too quick, too eager to confirm. Was she trying to convince them, or herself? Hastings turned his gaze to her, studying the way her hands clutched her handkerchief just a little too tightly. Then, a thought struck him. Hastings. And yet, Mrs. Havering, you never mentioned hearing anything else before the gunshot. No voices, no footsteps. She blinked, her lips parting slightly. The briefest flicker of hesitation crossed her face before she forced a weak smile. Zoe. Nothing at all. It was just silence. And then, bang. Japp didn't seem to notice, but Hastings did. She was lying. Before he could press further, the door creaked open. Roger Havering stepped in, his tall frame casting a long shadow across the room. His coat was still speckled with rain from his journey. His eyes were sharp, scanning the room before settling on his wife. "Roger, I assume you've all been questioning my wife in my absence." There was no warmth in his voice, only a controlled coolness. Japp stepped forward, his tone neutral. "Just routine, Mr. Havering. You understand." Roger gave a tight nod, his eyes flickering toward Hastings for the briefest moment before shifting back to Zoe. Was that a look of warning? Zoe's fingers clenched. Hastings watched the exchange. There was something between them, something unspoken. Japp turned to Roger. "Your alibi checks out, but I have to ask, did Mr. Pace have any enemies? Anyone who might have wanted him dead?" Roger let out a humorless chuckle. Uncle Harrington was a difficult man. He had more enemies than friends. But murder? He shook his head. "I can't imagine who would go that far." Hastings didn't believe him. And then, a sudden knock at the door. Everyone turned sharply. The housekeeper, Mrs. Middleton, appeared in the doorway, her face pale. "Mrs. Middleton. There's something you must see." Cliffhanger ending. With Zoe's exaggerated grief and Roger's cold demeanor, Hastings senses something deeper at play. But before he can piece it together, a new revelation from Mrs. Middleton threatens to change everything. What has she discovered? The unraveling. Poirot's silent triumph. The room was thick with tension, the dim candlelight flickering against the cold stone walls of the hunting lodge. The storm outside raged on, wind howling like a restless spirit, rattling the windows as if demanding entry. Hercule Poirot sat in his usual composed manner, his fingertips lightly pressed together, his keen eyes glinting with something undeniable certainty. Across from him sat Zoe Havering, her face a mask of polite confusion, but Poirot saw through it. He always did. Hastings, frowning, leaned closer. "Poirot, you've been awfully quiet. You've figured it out, haven't you?" Poirot gave a small smile, adjusting his perfectly pressed cuffs. "Monday, Ami, I do not figure things out. I simply see what others do not." Zoe shifted in her seat, a flicker of something in her eyes: nervousness, irritation, fear. Japp crossed his arms, exhaling impatiently. "Well, go on then, Poirot. What are you getting at?" Poirot's gaze finally settled on Mrs. Middleton, the ever-loyal housekeeper, standing in the corner, her hands neatly folded. She had been a silent observer all this time, her face hidden under the shadow of her bonnet. And then Poirot's voice sliced through the air. "Tell me, Madam Middleton, why is it that your accent falters when you are startled?" The room fell silent. Mrs. Middleton stiffened. Japp blinked. "What are you on about, Poirot?" Poirot stood, his steps slow, deliberate, circling Mrs. Middleton like a predator studying its prey. "You see, mes amis, I have been watching, listening, and something was not right." He gestured toward the woman. This housekeeper, this devoted Mrs. Middleton, her mannerisms, her voice, her very presence, see none of it is natural. Hastings furrowed his brows. "But what are you suggesting?" Poirot's lips curled into a knowing smirk. "I am not suggesting, mon cher Hastings. I am revealing." He turned sharply to Mrs. Middleton. "For she is not Mrs. Middleton at all. She never was." Gasps echoed through the room. Zoe Havering's fingers tightened on the arms of her chair. Poirot's eyes gleamed. "The real Mrs. Middleton never existed. The woman standing before us is none other than Zoe Havering herself." A sharp intake of breath. Japp's eyes widened. "What?" Hastings shot to his feet. "That's impossible. They were in the same room together." Poirot raised a finger. "Ah, and that, mon ami, is where the trick lies. A clever one, none, but not clever enough for Poirot." His voice dropped to a smooth, confident rhythm as he unraveled the deception piece by piece. Zoe Havering needed an alibi. What better way than to be in two places at once? She created Mrs. Middleton, disguised herself in plain sight, and no one ever questioned it. A little aging makeup, a change in posture, a shift in voice, it was enough to fool everyone. While Zoe remained safely in her room, Mrs. Middleton was free to move about unseen, unsuspected. She had the perfect freedom to commit the crime. Zoe's face remained unreadable, but her knuckles turned white against the chair's fabric. Japp scratched his head. "But wait, when did she switch back?" Poirot smiled. "That, my dear Japp, is the brilliance of her plan. She never truly switched back." The room felt even colder. The wind outside howled louder. Poirot stepped closer to Zoe, his eyes burning with finality. "You see, mon cher Hastings, when the murder was discovered, Mrs. Middleton was conveniently the one to sound the alarm, and just as the investigation started, she disappeared. Mrs. Middleton was no longer needed." Zoe reappeared, grief-stricken, dramatic, the perfect act. A silence fell over them like a heavy curtain. Hastings' mind raced. It had made sense. The little inconsistencies, the fleeting moments where Zoe seemed oddly composed, the slight shifts in Mrs. Middleton's behavior, it all fit. Japp exhaled sharply. "You mean to tell me?" But before he could finish, Zoe Havering did something unexpected. She laughed, a soft, amused chuckle that sent chills through the room. Zoe, smiling slightly. My, Monsieur Poirot, you really are remarkable." Poirot's face remained unreadable, his mustache barely twitching. Zoe leaned forward, resting her chin on one hand. "And yet, you have no proof." Another silence. Poirot smiled, a slow, confident smile. "Ah, madame, that is where you are wrong." Zoe's expression flickered for the first time. True fear crept in. Poirot reached into his pocket, pulling out a small, neatly folded handkerchief. He held it up between two fingers. The lace edges were faintly stained. Your disguise was flawless. Almost, but you see, makeup, it smudges. And in your haste to wipe away Mrs. Middleton, you left behind the smallest trace of foundation. Hastings felt his breath hitch. Jap's hand instinctively moved toward his revolver. Zoe's mask slipped. Her eyes darkened. And then bang! A gunshot. The room erupted in chaos. Hastings ducked. Jap lunged. Poirot stood still, his eyes fixed on Zoe, unshaken. The smoking gun trembled in her hand. Cliffhanger ending. The bullet lodged itself into the wooden beam behind Poirot. Zoe stood, breathless, trapped like a cornered animal. Poirot, ever composed, gave her a knowing look. Ah, Madame Havering. A desperate move, but alas, too late. The game was over. Or was it? The moment of truth. The storm outside had settled into a steady drizzle, but inside the dimly lit study, the tension was only growing stronger. The air smelled of aged wood and lingering gunpowder, a silent reminder of the crime that had shaken the Havering estate. Poirot sat comfortably in a high-backed chair, his fingertips lightly touching as he regarded Hastings with an expression of quiet amusement. Across from him, Hastings leaned forward, his brow furrowed in frustration. The fire crackled in the hearth, casting long shadows that danced ominously against the walls. Hastings exhaled sharply. Poirot, I know you're onto something, but I can't shake this feeling there's still something missing. Poirot chuckled softly. Ah, mon ami, your instincts are improving. You see the edges of the truth, but you lack the final brushstroke to complete the picture. Hastings frowned. How can you be so sure, Poirot? Poirot's eyes twinkled as he adjusted the cuffs of his immaculate suit. When you see the truth, it all becomes clear, Hastings. It is like a puzzle where every piece fits perfect once you know where to look. He leaned forward slightly, lowering his voice as if revealing a grand secret. Consider this, mon cher, 2 pistols. One crime, and yet one of these pistols is missing. Hastings' eyes widened. Wait, you mean? Poirot nodded. Exactement. Mr. Havering took one of the pistols with him to London. He disposed of it, making it seem as though there was no weapon unaccounted for. Meanwhile, Mrs. Havering, in the comfort of their estate, used the other pistol to commit the crime. A chill ran down Hastings' spine. It made perfect sense. The careful planning, the seemingly airtight alibis, it had all been orchestrated with meticulous precision. Jap, who had been listening with arms crossed, let out a low whistle. So they played it together. He gave himself an alibi in London while she stayed behind and pulled the trigger. Poirot inclined his head. A husband and wife in perfect harmony, Inspector. A deadly duet. Hastings ran a hand through his hair. But Poirot, we still don't have proof. We know what happened, but knowing and proving are two very different things. Poirot smiled. Ah, my dear Hastings, that is where the brilliance of the criminal mind often falters. They believe in their cleverness, but they always leave something behind. He stood up, adjusting his coat, and reached into his pocket. Slowly, almost dramatically, he pulled out a small, neatly folded silk handkerchief. Hastings blinked. A handkerchief? What does that have to do with anything? Poirot's smile deepened. This, mon ami, was found near the crime scene. It belonged to Mrs. Havering. He unfolded it carefully, revealing a faint, barely visible smudge of gunpowder. Jap's eyes darkened. That's gunpowder residue. Poirot nodded. Oui. You see, after firing the fatal shot, she instinctively wiped her hands, not realizing that the residue would linger. And this, gentlemen, is what will undo her. A heavy silence fell over the room. Hastings felt the weight of the moment settle over him. The case was coming to a close, but something still felt off. Then suddenly, a loud creak. The 3 men turned sharply toward the doorway. A shadow shifted just beyond the threshold. Hastings' pulse quickened. Someone had been listening. Poirot remained perfectly calm, his voice smooth as silk. Ah, I see we have an uninvited guest. A tense pause. Then, the door swung open. Standing there, face partially obscured by the flickering candlelight, was Zoe Havering. Her expression was unreadable, but in her eyes a glint of something dangerous. Cliffhanger ending. Poirot smiled. "Madame Havering, how lovely of you to join us." Zoe stepped inside, her heels clicking against the wooden floor. She didn't flinch. She didn't stammer. Instead, she let out a small, knowing laugh. "Well, Monsieur Poirot," she murmured, tilting her head, "I suppose it's time for the truth, or perhaps just another game." Blackout. The climax. The evening was heavy with silence, broken only by the faint ticking of the ornate clock on Poirot's desk. The air smelled of old books and fine tobacco, a familiar scent that usually brought comfort, but tonight there was an unmistakable weight in the room. Poirot sat in his favorite chair, his fingers gently steepled under his chin, eyes lost in thought. Across from him, Hastings swirled the brandy in his glass, staring at the amber liquid as though it might reveal answers to the unanswered questions lingering in his mind. The day's events had unfolded so suddenly, too suddenly. The news had arrived only hours ago. An airplane crash. Havering and Zoe, both dead. The very suspects they had so carefully unraveled, their secrets on the verge of being exposed, were now beyond justice. Hastings exhaled, the disbelief still settling in. "Poirot, it almost feels unreal. To come so close to the truth." And then, he gestured vaguely, struggling to find the words. "It all ends like this." Poirot did not respond immediately. His gaze remained fixed on a single spot on the desk, the case file. Now useless. A mystery solved, and yet it left no satisfaction. Finally, in a voice softer than usual, Poirot spoke. "It is curious, mon ami. Some people's fates are sealed by the smallest of actions." He tapped his fingertips together. "One step too soon, one moment too late, and destiny changes course. It is as though the past continues to haunt us. Nay, c'est pas." Hastings frowned. "You don't think it was an accident?" Poirot lifted his gaze, the light catching in his sharp, knowing eyes. "Ah, Hastings, you have learned much, I see." Hastings leaned forward, a chill running down his spine. "Poirot, do you mean to say that their deaths?" Poirot's lips curved into the faintest of smiles, but it was not one of satisfaction. It was the kind of smile that carried more questions than answers. "Let us just say," Poirot murmured, reaching for his cup of tea, "that sometimes justice has its own way of balancing the scales." A heavy silence followed. The fire flickered in the dimly lit study, casting shadows that stretched across the walls, as if the ghosts of the past still lingered. Hastings took a deep breath. "Poirot, this case was truly more complex than I could have imagined, but perhaps it's true what we think we know is never the full story." Poirot gave a slow nod, his eyes distant. "Indeed, mon cher, the truth is a puzzle with missing pieces, and sometimes those pieces are lost forever." A gust of wind howled outside. The clock struck midnight, and somewhere in the darkness, the past remained watching, waiting. Blackout.